Matt, thanks a million for joining me today. And we're here really, I think, hopefully to debunk some of the myths around the Building Safety Act. And this is a conversation you and I have had. And I've had at a lot of people, I think, over the past sort of 18 months. And so I think it'd probably be good if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself as a kickoff.
My name's Matt Breakwell. I'm from a company called Kimpton. So we're M&E projects and commercial fit out and decarbonisation, that kind of thing. And we've been working together, haven't we, on some projects. There's been loads of stuff going on in our office, loads of upskilling around the Act. Maggie's been helping us with some of that. But my role's business development. So I've sort of sat away from that sort of delivery end and design end. So I'm really keen to sort of find out how it affects my role and particularly the culture changes that we've been talking about.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt. And I'm Maggie. I'm an architect and a project manager. I've worked across a range of sectors and got really heavily involved with the Building Safety Act and the associated legislation just after the Act came into place, and spent a lot of time upskilling and you've been bored by me in terms of my awareness raising, but really keen to sort of start a sort of opener dialogue, Matt, because I think there's a lot of confusion going out there, and I want people to feel that they should engage and ask the questions.
So Maggie, we're hearing an awful lot of work about the Building Safety Act. I sit outside operations. I'm very much on the pre-construction and business development bid writing stage. So I'm seeing the changes at the procurement end. I'm not really up to speed with what's happening at the delivery end. Tell me more about it.
Yeah. Well, it's probably worth doing a little bit of a recap, Matt. I think the Building Safety Act obviously came out of the Grenfell disaster, but it built on existing legislation, and it's primarily designed to encourage people, to mandate people, if that's the right word, basically, to up their game. And so sadly, with Grenfell, the exposure of failures, of lack of accountability, of people taking on work that they really weren't competent to do, of people basically telling lies, and of fraudulent companies. And so the Building Safety Act is meant to regulate the industry better and to provide an infrastructure to deal with the gaps that have occurred as a consequence both of the deregularisation of the building regulations. So those are the documents that people use to make sure that a building is actually safe and structurally complies. And they were deregulated in the early 1980s. And so there were lots of gaps in those. And as a consequence, buildings weren't built as well as they should have been. It also deals with behaviours and ethics, which sadly has been omitted. And you and I have been in the industry for a while, and we know how important it is for someone to stand up and say they've made a mistake and to take that, take the hit of it. And this is meant to basically say, there are people in the industry, stand up, take accountability, make sure that others are aware of their responsibilities, make sure that other people are aware of, and I hate to go to the sanctions and the negative bit, but there are serious sanctions. To breach the Building Safety Act is actually a criminal offence. And the duties are on everybody in the industry. So it's, first thing foremost, it's a positive thing, and it's meant for everybody to, again, up their game, but that's for the benefit of future users of buildings, and it's the benefit of all the professions and all the industry. And secondly, most pertinently, it's not the construction design and management regulations, which came out in 2005, which were set up to improve construction safety, and unfortunately, the terminology in the Act uses the same terminology in the construction design and management regulations. So there's a lot of confusion. One of my aims is to clarify that and to clarify the distinction and to raise awareness of the difference and to raise awareness that everybody has a duty and that ethics and behaviours are really important, and it's really important to understand the legislation.
So you said that it's actually a criminal offence to breach the Act. Mm-hmm. What does that mean in practice to people working in the industry?
Well, in practice, it means that a lot of people are walking around operating within the industry and unaware that their duties and unaware that those duties are actually mandated. So they are obligations under the Act. and that even not knowing that you have a duty is a breach of the duty. So even by the fact that you don't know, that you're not aware, is actually a criminal offence. And there have to be sanctions, because the severity of it, the deaths that have been lost, and it wasn't just Grenfell, there were a number of disasters that predated, and it was apathy in the government, and, you know, just a general lack of momentum that stopped actions being taken. So yes, it is a criminal offence, and the sanctions are, you know, sort of an unlimited fine, or up to, I think it's up to 12 or 15 years in prison. And these are individual liabilities, Matt. I think that shows how important this act is, and that how important the implementation and the uptake of this legislation is if the sanctions are individual. So it's not just your organisation, it's you as an individual that could end up in the dock.
Right. So it sounds like a complete culture shift almost, because the construction industry at the moment is very adversarial, isn't it? Between, certainly in the supply chain, with the main contractors and the subcontractors, and even with the sort of design teams, architects and consultant designers and that kind of thing. But it sounds like everybody's suddenly wrapped up in making sure they comply.
Well, it is, and I think you're absolutely right, Matt, and it is sadly adversarial. And if you talk to insurance companies, and again, I've been talking to insurance companies, you know, sort of to see what how they're assessing impact. We're really over legalized industry as well, so people are quite fearful, because the first thing someone does is put a legal case against them for, sort of a breach of the contract. And this is statute, this is an act, this trumps, so this trumps contract all day long. But you're right, it is a culture change, and it's, and I think sadly the conversations I'm having at the moment with people are either apathy, ignorance, and at worst, absolute hostility to it, and still having conversations with contractors and agencies about, how do we get around this? And that is, completely astonishing. And it's been in effect now since the 1st of April 2022. And this is just the beginning. When you read now the government's response to the final Grenfell report has accepted, I think, all the recommendations. It's going to mandate all. I think 9 it has some questions over, but that includes, creating a regulator over all the construction industry. That includes licensing principal contractors. That includes a regulatory body to determine what products we can use in construction and licensing those. I mean, this is significant. The actual profession of fire engineer is going to be overhauled. All of those documents, they're called approved documents, Matt. So they're the guides that we use as an industry to determine how we achieve compliance. And as I've touched on before, in the 80s, they were deregulated to the point that they became, you could drive a bus through them. And the most pertinent line, I think, from the Grenfell inquiry was the race to the bottom. And I think anybody who is still thinking about a way to sidestep the legislation, to remember that it was greed, it was opportunism, it was, it was negligence, and it was fraud that caused the deaths of those people. Yeah,
and like you said, it's that race to the bottom, isn't it? That value engineering everything down to the nth degree. So why is this such a hot topic now, if it's been around since 2022?
It's a lot in the press at the moment because the government's responded to the last Grenfell report. This is just the beginning of a whole raft of legislation and culture change, between appointing a construction regulator over the whole construction industry and where that sits in government, licensing principal contractors, because you don't have to be qualified or accredited to be a contractor. Anybody can basically set up, form a limited company and set up, but actually licensing those. And that's how seriously this act considers the impact of construction and principal contractors on that compliance aspect of it, creating a regulatory body for building products. So, I mean, we know the cladding was probably the most widely sort of evocative issue in terms of Grenfell. But that company, it was fraud. They lied. They hid test certificates. They only declared aspects of it. The government are determined through this legislation to make sure that doesn't happen. So there's a regulatory body about the building products we'll actually use, and a new accreditation and certification, and they call them conformity bodies. So an overview on that, right down to fire engineers, about how to regulate and improve the competence and improve the accreditation associated with that aspect of it. So it's pertinent because the responses come out. This is the beginning of, I think what the government are looking at between now and 2028, when the whole raft of changes and new legislation will be implemented. There will be this is the beginning of a sea change in the industry. And again, I feel it's really critical that we do our bit to raise awareness and to encourage people to get on board with it, because it is tremendously positive. It's tremendously positive in terms of the impact on credibility across the industry of my profession, of construction, of the professionals involved, that we've got the opportunity to step up and very openly step up and lead this process.
We're already seeing changes in relationships with some of our customers, in the fact that we're getting involved much earlier in the design process. That's something that we've always advocated for and always asked to be involved sooner. Look, if you hadn't put the wall there, we wouldn't be needing to drill stuff through it. You've left us no room in the plant room and that kind of thing. Whereas now we're sort of right around the table working through these gateway stages much sooner. So that seems to be certainly from the sort of procurement stage, seems to be a change in culture.
Yeah, and you're absolutely, and you touch on gateway, Matt, and that's the other question, because again, in this sort of myth debunking aspect, and people say, oh, it only applies to high risk buildings, that means multi-story residential. Yeah, a high risk building is a formal definition, and for this point in time, it means a residential building of more than 7 stories and over 18 meters. But part of this new shift and change of legislation is that the government are planning to review that. And again, that gives people a get out, and we don't need that get out. And it's encouraging that, and I hope they're doing it for the right reasons, that people are saying, actually, no, we need this expertise. I mean, when you and I were sort of coming up through the industry, and I can remember that somebody saying to me, risk is always best placed for the person who's, most able to deal with it. And it makes perfect sense economically as well as ethically and in terms of compliance that the person, that you guys are involved at an early stage, but it doesn't often happen. And I think, again, the opportunity here is to raise the value of that input and to raise the value of the professional input into that at the early stage. And it's also been mandated, not just with high risk buildings that, and we'll touch on principal designer role, but it's not just with high risk buildings, but it's with every building. And it's understanding that sort of trickle down effect happens with, if you're just doing a house extension, or if you're designing, sort of a 25-story tower, that your responsibility, not just to get the thing built safely as the construction design and management regulations set out, it's about the future safety of that building. So if somebody 10 years time with a fire brigade, and that's the idea of the sort of, and we talked about it, this process will create a pack of information that's auditable and accessible. So if there's a fire in 10 years time, the fire brigade have got that information. They press the button. So before they attend, they know exactly where the fire doors are. They know exactly where the compartmentation. They're not going into what Grenfell was. And so if you look at the trickle down effect, this isn't just about ticking the box. And I think that's where the sea change has got to happen.
Yeah.
This is saying, I have to do it. Oh goodness, I have to do it. I have to tick the box. It's like, no, this is for the benefit of, and this will be for the betterment, not just of the construction industry, but also the future credibility of development.
So who does the Act affect?
Everybody. I mean, at top of the tree, and I think this is the biggest challenge when you read the legislation, which I recommend everybody does, because I don't know, I would say that as the nerd I am, but I reckon because sadly there's so many misinterpretations of it, and I think you got to go to the source. But the first line goes, the client must ensure that they have appointed competent professionals. So the liability starts with the client. even down to, again, the house extension, right up to those sort of organizations that procure services. And as I touched on in terms of liability, what the Act asks and states is not just the organization is the client, that you've actually got something called a designated individual. So that person actually puts their name on the line and they sign off that they can confirm that building has complied with building regulations. And that's significant. And again, it's a singular and individual risk. I mean, what they're planning to do now in terms of the new legislation is they're planning to basically make the directors almost take out personal guarantees for construction firms to sign to say that they can confirm that the building's actually been built in compliance. So that's how, closing that loop. So the client's got to ensure that they've got competent people. But again, back to the professions have a duty of care to support their client, and they've got a duty of care to understand when their competence is exceeded, and that's actually mandated. So you've got to say to your client, I'm competent to do this job, and I'm competent in terms of the current requirements, or I'm not competent. And they also shouldn't progress with a scheme, and that's actually in the legislation. Again, no designer should progress with a scheme until a competent principal designer is appointed. And obviously the principal designer is this new role, which we'll touch on. Now that's fairly serious, and that's very serious. And if you've got a contract with a client where the client's saying to you, you need to progress, we've got deadlines, we've got planning to put in, and you're going back and saying, but you haven't got a principal designer appointed. And so hence there's a mismatch between what the contract says, and unfortunately the construction law aspect hasn't quite caught up. And so you've got, again, adds to the ambiguity, adds to the fear and the reticence, and again, either the apathy or the hostility towards the legislation. So clients, anybody who is a designer, and that includes people who put ironmongery together, so your door handles, window frames, right up to the fire engineers, and contractors as well. So whether you're a principal contractor or not, so anybody who basically either designs or builds something that ultimately has to comply with building regulations, and anyone who procures the services of either a designer or a contractor are liable, and they're called the duty holders, Matt.
So basically you're going right from the client right the way through the supply chain, aren't you? Right the way through the subcontractors. Completely. And there's a sort of subtext to all of this, in that it's almost as if the legislation is trying to ease the industry away from a procurement method called design and build. Mm-hmm. So you'll know this, Matt, but just maybe some of our audience won't. Design is where designers will take the scheme to a certain point. Not necessarily fully construction or technical details, perhaps not even building regulations approval, and then they'll hand it over to the contractor, and the contractor will build that scheme, and they will be they will have to undertake building regulations approval. But at that point, control's lost, if that makes sense. And again, I always refer back to Grenfell. That was one of the aspects. There was a lack of continuity between evidencing how compliance is achieved, and actually stuff fell through the gaps. Like the contractor went behind the consultant's back to the residents and presented something called, as you touched on, value engineering, which says, we could get this job going if you go for a cheaper cladding. Mm-hmm. Now, unless you're the person that understands what that means to go for cheaper cladding, you say, that's great, it saved us money. Yeah. And so that's one of the aspects. It's trying to close up. So the legislation is trying to close up those loops. There will be people in small organizations who won't be aware and who are keen to understand. And there is tolerance for that. And the legislation's written, and this sort of recent case law is written, that's saying once you accept it, and if you supplement your competency, so if you haven't got knowledge of X, Y, and Z, or you haven't got knowledge of the legislation, then you bring someone in, that proactive attitude is going to be supported by the law. If you still persist in ignoring it, and in fact taking a hostile attitude to that, that's when the law, the legal system will sort of come down with a, absolute sort of thunderbolt, because that is fundamentally against the ethics and the spirit. That is effectively the attitude that this legislation will weed out. So it's it's really forcing that collaboration that we've all been arguing for years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than this adversarial back and forth and this shifting of responsibilities, the Act is almost forcing us to collaborate, which is what most of the industry have been saying for years is the best way to build.
Oh, completely, Matt. And it's great because I think that those organisations like you have, and, you know, sort of to a lesser extent we have, where we've been cut out because the value in our expertise and also our ability to manage risk and our ability to lead the process and to identify when areas are not compliant, that hasn't been valued by the industry. But the change will be when the elements of our industry that are either ignoring it or hostile to it actually accept it and understand it in their DNA, that this isn't just something to be endured, this is something to be capitalized on, and this is something to be embraced. And that's where the big journey is. No,
but the problem with the whole industry, there's always been somebody behind, whatever advice you're trying to give to the client, there's always been somebody behind you that will do it cheaper. And will drive that sort of that race to the bottom. And I think what's really different about this is you're starting with the client.
Yeah.
So you're saying to the client, you can't do that race to the bottom. You've got to do something that's fit for purpose.
Absolutely.
And if it's not fit for purpose, you're carrying the can personally.
Yeah. And I think that makes and again, absolutely makes a big difference. And they're still doing it, Matt, even with the role that I've upskilled to do. And it was quite onerous to do. And I think there's only 60 people on the RIBA accredited principal designer register. Now, that is great for me in many ways. And I was the 11th person on the list to do it. But quite sad about my profession not taking that up. So that's one thing which is lamentable. But I've been approached by a company who offering me the services that I offer, and they're not competent. And, you know, again, I've gone back and said to them, but you cannot take this project that on, or we're going to do the heavy lifting, but you're misleading the client and you're taking a commercial advantage. But triply sort of pretentious or challenging is the fact that you're leaving the client at risk and you're leaving the design team at risk because you've made an offer on the premise that you can undertake this role and you can't. The client thinks you're competent, and so they think they're off the hook. And the designers think that you're competent, so they're off the hook. But everybody is now in breach of the Act. You're fine because you can walk away. But the client's at risk. The client's breached because they haven't evidenced competence, and the designers haven't satisfied themselves that you are a competent principal designer. And so you have breached the Act on every level, behaviourally, ethically, you know. So, and that is, and unfortunately, and that's what's happening now as we understand it from the legal profession, is that those are the individuals and organisations that are coming to the fore now in terms of case law. You know, it's where they have got to the end of a project and, well, I can't sign that. I never said I was a competent principal designer. Oh, you didn't ask me. You didn't ask the right questions. And so
what happens then? What happens then at the end of the project? If you haven't followed the new Act right the way through, what happens at the end of the project? You can't get it signed off.
Well, and again, rolling back, at the end of a project, if you've submitted a building regs, depending on if you're a high-risk building it doesn't matter. High-risk building is a little bit more onerous because you have to go through what's called a gateway process. And it's like the old-fashioned full plan submission. So back in my day, you had to do all the drawings and you had submitted them to the local authority before you did anything, and they would rubber stamp and say, yes, it complies with building regulations, or no. But you didn't start on site. You didn't even go out to tender until that happened. And then with the deregulation of building regulations in the 80s, you had this sort of deregularization of the approved building control inspectors. So someone could stand alongside you and you could start site at any point as long as you'd issued the notice before you'd done any of those drawings. So,
and we always found in a previous life, I had building contractors and we were doing sort of, you know, things like house extensions and loft conversions. And it was always much easier to get sign off from a private building control officer than it was by using the local authority.
And absolutely, and I think again in the Grenfell report, the final Grenfell report, that's identified the potential conflict of interest between private approved inspectors And,
Yeah, because suddenly the builder's the customer.
And approved compliance. So that's on the target list. So if you've got a high risk building, you've got to go through this gateway process, which adds time. And by the time you actually get to gateway 2, you should have produced all that information that is subject to building regs and submitted it. And then you wait for 12 weeks. And the approved inspector is the health and safety executive, called the building safety regulator. So it's apparently only 15% of applications that have gone in to the building safety regulator under what's called the HRB, high risk building regime, have been approved. Now, I know there's been a lot of trade press about, the health and safety executive. You're obviously the building safety regulator.
Well, I've read that they haven't had the capacity and there's 600 schemes being held up.
No. The feedback that we've had recently has been that it's been to do with the quality of the applications. And again, it is the culture, we'll just stick it in anyway. And so it's been, per applications, no principal designer appointed, no principal contractor, nobody having undergone any of the sort of stages, anybody with a knowledge of it. This is to do with, very blatantly ignoring, trying to avoid or sidestepping the regulation. And what's happening is that, you can imagine the delays for 85% of those applications not going through. And again, the misinformation in the industry. So it's about, again, sort of making aware of the implications of that.
The commercial impact of that's going to be massive then, isn't it?
Oh.
A large part of our business is high risk buildings.
Yeah.
Purpose-built student accommodation schemes, big build-to-rent schemes. And we are seeing a slowdown in the pipeline. Mm-hmm. But that's a real worry if I assumed from what I read that was a capacity for the government to actually get them signed off.
No, and again, but we talk about opportunity. That's an opportunity for sort of organisations and people who have upskilled to step in and say, we're here, we can do this, we can achieve this. I mean, to me, it's sad that the culture, it's not a case of, oh my goodness, I didn't know. It's more a case of, it'll go away. It will go away. Yeah. And I think that, to me, is what's got to be addressed. And sadly, and you and I both know, unless there's a commercial, pinch, that's the first thing. That's the thing that predates the ideological road. Predates the ideological road to Damascus. Oh yes, absolutely. I see, ideologically we were aligned. When the purse starts to, or you stop getting projects, or you're being asked to evidence, what I'm doing now as principal designer, is asking for evidence of how people have executed their duties.
The commercial imperative will come first, and the culture will follow.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, Matt, is, and I don't know whether you found this, and you probably have, because it's the misconceptions and the misunderstandings. And I know we've talked about a little bit of opportunism and, people jumping on the bandwagon and offering services that completely undermine the spirit of the Act. Even I've found information that's conflicting. Sort of, I know the high risk building regime, and some of the finer detail is that a lot of this legislation is built on existing legislation. And not to sound too boring, the 1984 Building Act. And there was a definition of a high-risk building in that. And you have the difference between a high-risk building, what is called in occupation, and in design and construction. And I've sat in a meeting with very sort of laudable advisors who've been advising a client that because their building is partially occupied, that they are sort of, they are outside the HRB regime and therefore don't have to go through the gateway process. And that is fundamentally incorrect, because in occupation means it's up and running, it's being used, but there's no design or construction being done on it. So, but that has come up on AI. And I know, the conversation about concerns for liability. And it is that aspect of, I think people are worried. And they are duly worried, but they're worried for the wrong things. So they're worried about, again, extending their liability almost in a contractual way, but not understanding the impact in terms of the law and the legislation. And also, nobody's expecting anybody to go beyond what they're competent to do. But what they're asking people and organisations to do is to make sure that they're as up to date as possible. They acknowledge when they've got to the limits of their competency, and they make clients aware. And they also do their duty to make others aware of the legislation if there are areas of non-compliance. Sorry about the scurrying, it's the dog. Areas of non-compliance. So this is really about everybody individually taking that little bit more responsibility, not just for themselves and their organisations, but for the wider industry.
Mm-hmm. So how does the new Act differ from CDM?
Oh, it's a really good, I think that's a question on everybody's lips, Matt, and it hasn't helped that the same terminology is being used. So you've got principal designer, CDM, building safety. You've got principal contractor, CDM, building safety. It's fundamentally different, and the easiest way to describe it, probably two strands. One is that CDM, sort of basically anybody could set themselves up as a principal designer under CDM. You've got to be familiar with health and safety. You assemble information about construction risks. So it's about mitigating accidents on site, and it's about planning, anticipating and mitigating those. The Building Safety Act and the Building Safety Principal Designer is about ensuring compliance with building regulations, so that building isn't just safely constructed, that building is safe for its entire life and for its users. And so what it requires and necessitates is an industry that is upskilled and understands building regulations compliance, the legislation that's associated with it, and the application of that. So fundamentally, and that's the crux of where the issue is. In my profession, when the CDM came in 2005, nobody wanted to do it. It's more paperwork. We weren't going to get paid for it. Back to me. And so, and you had this, you had the rise of the, sort of independent advisor, again, a bit like the person who approached me to offer me principal designer services.
Yeah.
They step into the breach. They were doing the things that nobody else wanted to do. And so, I think my industry, my profession, just like CDM, it'll go away. Somebody will come in and it'll go away. And what they don't realise,
get the boxes ticked.
Absolutely, get the boxes ticked.
Yeah.
And and I'll say that as well. I was quite happy. I don't want to do a risk register. Oh goodness me. But the Building Safety Act is in all of our DNA. We're all liable. We're all duty holders. The minute we put a line to paper, whether it's to design drainage or it's design, we are a designer. And so we are a duty holder in the Act. And so with that designation comes a list of things that we have to do. And it's the same with the contractor. The minute you start to put something together physically, so you start to assemble that building, you are liable. You are named in that Act. And so that idea that and I think when I turned up to start being principal designer in some projects, I've obviously done on my own, but also brought in to supplement, which is absolutely right, to supplement existing design teams. Very much seen as a bit of a weird observer aspect of it, and also seen as dealing with building safety. I mean, that isn't the case. This is about making sure that everybody's aware of your duties, and that you are liable. You're not doing me a favor. You're executing your duties. The client has appointed me. They've got to evidence, and you touched on this earlier. Just before you get your red ribbon, and the contractor knows that they're coming up to their sort of to the final account, and they're coming up to handing over their duties and responsibilities of the project to the client. It's a very important contractual point, and you've made that application for the final certificate for building regulations. And what the approved inspectors and I will do once you submit a project at the beginning, or submit your interest to submit a project, they will tell you what they expect. And what they will expect is a signed declaration from the client, so organisationally and individually, that building complies with building regulations. And that requires an auditable evidence base of compliance. So that's a tracker that shows whose input into the project, who owns it, what route to compliance, the competence declarations of every designer. So that could be designers that are appointed under the client, designers that are appointed under the contractor, that they've all got to be evidence there. But that individual client has got to take that statutory commitment and certification that the building has complied. And then principal designer signs a declaration to say, have you done your duty to the best of your abilities? Yes. Principal contractors do the same. Now, no final certificate can be issued until those three declarations have been made. So if you have a situation with a client who suddenly wakes up and goes, I'm not signing that. I don't understand what that means. And I've had that conversation with clients when I've been brought in late. What does that mean for me? Does that mean I'm liable? What does that mean? What does that mean? And the delays. So what happens in that landscape when the contractor's going, oh, clock's ticking, I'm still paying. Oh, this is liquidated and ascertained damages. I'm keeping the insurance up for that building. I've still got my men on that site, or women on that site. What happens? And in that contractual sort of no man's land, who pays for that liability? And will the client say, I wasn't told?
And when you're capturing every one of these designers, like we said earlier, you're talking about everybody in that supply chain, aren't
Indeed.
you? Because I'm thinking about things like in the M&E supply chain, things like door controls, data, sprinklers, fire stopping,
Yes.
smoke dampers, everything that's sort of all of our specialist supply chain that are involved in designing a project that we're doing, they're all captured in that, aren't they?
No, Matt, you're absolutely right. And you are, if you're procuring those services and you're taking those under your umbrella, then you are acting as principal contractor under the Act. And so you have got to, a bit like it says, you're the client, you have got to be absolutely confident that those people have the competence, those organizations have the competence, and those individuals have the competence. And, again, explaining what competence means in terms of the legislation, explaining that's the duty holder. So, if there are gaps in that assembly, so if you find that there's no tracker, there's nobody who's actually made any notes in terms of keeping good records about whether they took the building regs route or if they took a British standard route to compliance, and you've got a 3-month downtime to assemble that information. So the final certificate can be issued. Who pays for that? Where does the liability lie? What happens when a multi-million-pound contract overruns by 3 months?
Well, what happens when a student accommodation can't open for September?
Completely.
Yeah.
And these are the implications. And then you sort of have the situation where, it's running alongside the contractual obligations or the statutory obligations. Have you really been operating outside the legislation for the past 3 years? Why has nobody, client, either internally made you aware of your obligations? Why has nobody within the design team made you aware under their duty of care of your obligations? And goodness me, why have they progressed when you hadn't had a principal designer appointed? Because that's in the Act. You shouldn't have done that. So you should not be here. And there should not be gaps in the evidence, because if your team and your principal contractor were competent, you wouldn't have an issue. You would be here, you'd be well informed, you'd have all the information, you'd be able to sign. So it's a circular process, and it is a case ignorance is no defence.
This sounds like almost like a seismic shift in the industry. Where do people start?
Oh, I mean, it's enormous. The best thing to really do is to read the legislation. I won't push, obviously look for support and bring it in, and again, we sort of, I'm not taunting ourselves, but one of the things I see is really important is to raise awareness, and, the best thing to do is to supplement, is to look at bringing somebody or some expertise in to capacity build within your organizations. And it isn't just, oh my goodness, have you read, the building regulations, etc., England, etc., Amendment 2023. It is the cultural shift and the opportunities associated with that. And, and sort of navigating the landscape as well, which I find with some client organizations who, I should know this, and so I'm fearful to ask the questions. And we're almost at that point where, goodness, it's been 3 years, and should I really be asking the question? But yes, absolutely, ask the question. Now is the time. Now is better than sort of pretending it's going to go out, because it isn't, and it's actually going to grow legs. And so the next stages are obviously this new construction regulator who is going to be appointed over the whole construction industry. The licensing of principal contractors, the legislation around building products. There are a lot of parallel legislation. There's an awful lot of consultations going to go out into the industry, and understanding and embracing more understanding, not just in our little silo of what we do. So myself as an architect and project manager, and yourselves produce, in terms of mechanical, electrical and plumbing and those associated services, is understand other areas of the industry and understand what drives those, and actually be advocates. And I think that's the thing that we need. I think this is the thing that the industry needs is for the likes of you and me and your company and your individuals to start the dialogue and to start the debate and ask the questions, and make people comfortable with asking the questions, and make people comfortable with starting that. Goodness, I didn't know. Oh, can I ask this question? And just raising awareness, but raising awareness not just about the sanctions, but raising awareness of the opportunities that are out there, because there will be. Getting involved with the consultations about the construction regulator, getting involved with the regulations about the building products regulator, the licensing of principal contractors, that sort of aspect, particularly with a company like yourselves and those credible organisations you work with, those are the agencies that should be involved and advising the construction regulator about, what's actually happening at the coalface.
It's back to that collaboration, isn't it, as well? Yeah. If you can advise your client, it's always been the way, hasn't it, that if you can put your arms around your client and make their lives easy and make a project happen well, then that's always great for business, isn't it? And this really is an opportunity to do that when you're looking at the client's whole liability.
Oh, it
under
is.
The Act.
It is. But leading the process, Matt, as well, and not being fearful of saying things that necessarily won't be acceptable to hear. And that's what's important now, is to be able to say, there's no easy way of saying this, but you've got to step up to the mark, and there's no easy way of saying this, but you aren't competent. I can't people please you.
Yeah.
This has got to come from you. We can support you. But this has got to come from you. And that's where the cultural shift will have to come, because the cultural shift is, this isn't just about something that I it's not a coat I put on every time I go out, and it's not a face I put on. This has got to be intrinsic in the next generation of clients, whether they be the NHS, whether they be education, whether they be our developer clients. That this is not this is, oh goodness, there's something else we have to, it's another bit of paperwork. Oh my goodness, this is amazing. And this is probably you're right, seismic. This has been the biggest significant impact upon the construction industry, certainly during my period of being qualified. And
it changes that relationship, doesn't it, with the client? Because if the client's got that ultimate responsibility and that personal liability, you've got to, the client's going to be more interested in what you're telling them, isn't it, as an
Absolutely.
expert? Because you're not just saying, listen, don't put that piece of air conditioning equipment in because it's a bit rubbish and the life cycle cost is going to be higher in the long run. That's very easy to knock back, isn't it? And say, well, listen, we'll save some capex here, and it'll, we won't worry about the maintenance costs 5 years, 10 years down the line. But when you're talking about complying with an act that puts personal responsibility and a criminal liability, it's a different conversation completely, isn't it?
And it's all, and again, the flip side of that is the credibility of that message. And the new legislation and the new reforms are going to absolutely, double, underpin the credibility of those organisations who do embrace it. And so, you and I will have these conversations. You have you meet with a client, and it's, are you really saying this because there's money involved in it for you, or are you saying this because it's in the best interest of the project and me as the client? Yes, the latter, because we've been through this process. We've evidenced that we've accepted and we've embraced this act, and we've stepped up to the mark. And we've stepped up for the right reasons. And
then and everything's got that integrity then.
Completely.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Maggie. I've learned loads. I've seen this going on in the industry and in the offices. This isn't my area of expertise. It's not something I've been involved in, but the cultural shift, I think, is massive and is going to create some real opportunities for good companies.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Matt. And I've really, enjoyed it. And every day is a learning day, because it's interesting how, sort of the nuances of what happens when you get into contract and what's happening in the legal side of it. And it is about, it being here and being open and asking the questions, and isn't a case of somebody saying, oh goodness, you don't know X, you don't know Y. Nobody really does. And it's about, again, the whole culture change is about saying, one, I didn't know that. 2, I'll find someone who does, and 3, I'll make sure that it's covered.
Yeah.
And thanks a million, Matt. I mean, it's not sort of not easy being the full guy to me talking at you for for this period of time, but really value and again, it's the dialogue, and I really appreciate how candid you've been as well.
Great. No, thanks very much, Maggie. Really interesting.